One of my favorite things about web development is that there's always more than one way to accomplish a particular task. So in the last lesson, I demonstrated how you can use services to validate your data. But it's possible that you may prefer keeping all of that contained within your model. And that's certainly a valid way to go about it as well. So in those situations, what is the best way to tackle validation directly within the model? Well, I'll show you how in this lesson. Now we are going to continue with the exact base that we used in the last lesson. The only difference is, if I scroll down to the store method, you can see I've cleared that out so that we can start from scratch. All right, let's begin by interacting with our quote-unquote API before we actually build the logic for it. And that way we can make sure that it's as readable as possible. So what I would like to do in this case when we are storing data is maybe I'll say post equals a new post, and then I'm going to pass in the input. Now, as I noted in the last lesson, Laravel now protects us against mass assignment vulnerabilities. Now, in the last lesson, I showed you how you could set a whitelist, which basically means which fields may be updated. This time, we're going to do the opposite. I'll say protected, guarded equals an empty array. And this is essentially the opposite. All we're saying here is we're not going to guard any of the fields. So in Laravel 4, you have a whitelist for fillable and a blacklist for guarded. Now, if I switch back, let's continue on. Maybe we want to say, well, if post save, if it was saved and it passed validation, then we want to return, redirect to the index route or the post collection. Otherwise, we're going to, as we did before, redirect back with the input and also with the errors. And I'm going to assume that maybe we have an errors property on the post object now. So that's how I want to interact with this. Now let's write the code to make that possible. Well, the first thing is I could place it directly within the post model, but once again, we come to that reuse issue. What about when we are validating a different model? Well, we certainly don't want to repeat our code. Now, in the last lesson, we used a separate validation service for this. But if we're going to do it within a model, this time we need to create, how about a base model? So I'll create base model. And this will be mostly the same, but it's going to extend Eloquent. And then all of our Eloquent models are going to extend the base model. So I will save that. And now post is going to extend base model. Now, base model is where we can handle the validation. So we will say function validate, and as before, we'll say validation equals validator make. We're going to get the attributes directly off of the post model and compare that against any rules that we have set. So we're going to assume that every Eloquent model has a set of rules that can be validated. So we'll do protected static rules equals, and here, once again, title is required, and then the same thing for the body. So let's continue on with the base model. Now we've created our validator. Let's simply return validation passes. However, this is simply going to return a Boolean. So if you think about it, if we run the validate method, it's going to validate the data and return true or false. However, if it does return false, we need some way to capture the errors. So how about this instead? If validation passes, then return true. Or, as we did in the last lesson, let's just keep it on one line. Otherwise, we're going to say this errors equals, and we'll grab the validation messages. Finally, we will return false. Next, I'm going to add public errors so that we can access it outside of the class. So this helps, but still we have a problem. If I go back to our post controller, when we call post save, and that's just a built-in method on the Eloquent model, how can we tell it that we want to execute this validate method? Well, we can use the new Laravel 4 event listeners, and this is simply a pub submodel that you can use in Laravel, and you can extend it however you wish. It has some built-in listeners and publishers, and then you can add more if you want. And if you'd like to learn more about this, definitely refer to the Laravel 4 documentation. But I'll give you a basic overview. If I switch over to my Eloquent model, and I view the save method, you'll see it creates the query, and then it fires a model event called saving. And this is where we can hook into it at this point and then perform our validation. And if we return false from that event, well then this method is going to return false and the data is never going to be saved. But if it returns true, it's simply going to continue on and perform the insertion. So how can we hook into this? Well, we can either use the event class, event listen, or we can access it directly from the model. Now we can do so by using the boot method, and this is something you can grab from the Laravel 4 documentation. The boot method is available to extend specifically so that you can hook up these sorts of listeners. Now we do want to make sure no matter what, if we add our own boot method, that we still trigger the parent's boot method. But then after that, you can do whatever you want. So we will say static. When it is saving, we're going to listen for that specific event, saving. Then we're going to run a function, and it's going to accept the post object. Then all we're going to do is call the validate method on the post object. So I can return post validate. And that's it. So now anytime we are saving a model, whether you're updating or inserting, this is going to run, at which point we call the validate method. This validate method is going to run with the data. Now, if it passes validation, this is going to return true, at which point the model is going to return true, so this never runs, and we continue on. However, if we return false, meaning that the validation failed, then, if I scroll back up, this event will return false, in which case we return false from the model's save method. And then if I scroll back to the post controller, you'll see that this will never fire, in which case we return with the input. Hopefully that makes sense. If not, go back and watch that one more time. So let's save that. Everything looks good. And now let's run it in the browser to make sure that this still works. Here I am once again within the create method. I will click submit, and we do get an error, and I did this specifically to show you Laravel now has much prettier error displays using the pre-existing whoops package that's now native to Laravel, so that we now have this pretty way to debug our applications. I think it looks great. Anyhow, now we can see cannot make static method boot non-static, and of course it's saying, hey, you can't make this static method non-static. And of course, let's go back and fix that and try it again. From create, I'll click submit, and now you'll see we get the exact same thing. If I add some data, click submit, it still works exactly the way it did before. So now this is mostly up to you. What do you prefer? Do you prefer to keep your validation within a service? That's certainly one way to go about it. It's easily testable. However, if you prefer to keep it in the model, that's a way to go about it as well. And because we've done it in this manner, you can still test that as easily as you would anything else. So have a play with both of these options and let me know which one you like best.